talking about hell, right? Sounds like a cheerful topic given the circumstances we are in. Um, by the way, we could try this. If you are in a home that is especially quiet, you can maybe try having yourself off of mute. It sounds a little better when I can hear some kind of background noise. It makes me feel much less like I'm talking to myself. And that way, some of us are maybe more prepared to respond. It would be good to try see if we can get a little bit more interaction on these. But if you've got any kind of noise, I guess Anthony can help monitor it. Then we can keep you muted. So something to think about. Um,
Yeah, everyone has the option to unmute themselves, but yeah.
I learned this too. If you're using a computer and you're on mute, at least with Mac, if you hold down the space bar, it temporarily unmutes you like it's a walkie-talkie. So you can kind of toggle back and forth between mute by doing that.
Oh, wow.
So that's a nice little feature. All right, well, let's go ahead and start with the word of prayer, and then we'll go ahead and jump into the lesson. Calvin, would you like to lead us?
Sure. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you, God, for this day. Thank you, God, for the time that we have to worship you and to read more about your word. Lord, help us to focus more on you during these times and focus on those that are in need, those that are ill, those that need your encouragement, God. It's very easy for us to think about us and how hard it can be for us, Lord, but help us to think about those that are truly in need, that are lonely. And may we see your word as comfort and praying to you as being one of the greatest comforts we can have, because we can talk to you and know more about you, God. Lord, help us to consider more about what you have us to do and what you call us to do, God. Thank you, God, for all the things you have given us. In your son's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Very good. All right. Okay. Like I said before, we're gonna be looking at the topic of hell. I think for the quarter I've got, I'm gonna start off by exploring some of these kinds of topics, discussing heaven, hell, discussing heaven, maybe talking about Hades, Sheol, and some things like that. It seems like it's been a while since we've been able to do a somewhat academic focused topic. I don't know. For me, I felt like doing something that is maybe fun, diving into, like a topic, exploring, doing some research. So hopefully it'll be a good change of pace and at least an interesting topic. Obviously, we'll be considering how this can be practically useful in our lives. I had a lot of fun preparing this. I felt like I learned a good bit, and I'm also kind of encouraged by how much I feel like we are actually able to know about hell. And it's not really that ambiguous or mysterious. I think there's really a lot of material in scripture that can help us nail down some very specific things about it. And I'm anxious to share some of those things I've learned with you today. Let's start off in very camp-like fashion. First question, you guys can unmute some of yourselves. What does hell mean to you? Kind of like, what are some of the basic preconceived ideas about hell? Everybody knows a lot about hell just right off the bat. So what are just some things we know about hell? Or at least we think we know about hell. Okay, place of punishment.
I just think about endless torture.
All right, endless torture. Jennifer, what?
I was just going to say separation from God because of our consequences.
Very good. Very good. What else?
A real place in the same way that heaven is a real place, even though it's spiritual.
Okay, an actual location, albeit spiritual. Maybe have we heard some, maybe what we would consider erroneous understandings of hell going around? So maybe some common understandings that we might think are erroneous.
That's a fun place to go because that's where all the fun bad people are.
True story. Me and JD were doing evangelism in Central Park and handing out flyers and stuff. And this guy's like, "I'm a musician, man. It's where all the music guys are. It's where I want to be." I'm like, all right, have fun with that. So the cool place to go if it's your style. What else? That did not sound very hell-like. We got at least one more.
Was that talking about the controversy?
I think
The controversy. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
oh no, go for it. It's okay.
Um, Many people believe that it's not permanent and eternal, but you just burn up and it's over. It's in
Okay.
a moment of disappearance.
There you go. So annihilation. I think that's actually a word. Annihilationism, I think, is the word for that. So it's not eternal punishment. It's just a destruction, permanent destruction. Another common idea is that hell is run by the devil. It's the devil's domain, almost rivaling heaven, things of that nature. So I say all that to say this. Hell is one of those things that we never learn about. We know what hell is long before we ever remember learning about what hell is. And if nothing else, you learn about hell from watching Looney Tunes. And so it becomes very difficult to actually objectively separate what we biblically know about hell and what we've always just assumed about hell. And the same thing would go for heaven. And another problem is, I think, some unfortunate translation has kind of entered into the picture to muddy the waters a little bit. But of course, we're going to take a nice look at the translation of hell. That's a big part of this lesson today. Some controversies, we mentioned it, whether hell is real or not. Is God really going to punish people in hell? Things of that nature. One last question here. Why is it important for us to study hell? Why is it important for us to know the biblical truth about hell? What practical importance would that have?
Well, I think because of all the confusion, it's just a muddy concept. I think that's one reason it's important.
Okay. With all the confusion, we get into a lot of romanticism of hell, get into like fantastic, like almost mythos, really diving into some of the, fantasy mythos aspects of it rather than having clear understanding. What else?
I think maybe to help us in our, like, for our own faith and also thinking about others. So I think about, like Paul says to keep our eyes on the prize, but then there's also like, there's not the prize, right? Like you can get the prize, which is great, but then what if you don't get the prize? It's not like you get to the middle ground, which I think maybe there's like part of the misunderstandings is that there's this middle place for like the okay kind of people. So it's either you get it or you don't. So I think maybe for that reason, and then also thinking about other people, like if, not that we talk about hell to people and that's not how we bring people to the gospel, but there is that side of it that sometimes I personally don't like to talk about. I feel like you don't want to fear factor people into something, but also it's a reality as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very, very good comment. Certainly our understanding about what comes next is going to impact what we do now. Probably the biggest factor there is, the majority of us are in that middle ground. We're not, these amazing people, but we're not Hitler either. And if there's this contentment that we're going to end up in a middle ground that we're deserving of, then all urgency, we're not trying to overachieve, but we don't have any real reason to, make sure that we're good either. So that's the real danger. So understand the true nature of what hell is will heavily impact how we live in the present. But also, like if we understand what hell is and how hell is, if we know how God or how Jesus speaks about hell, then that's going to help us know how we should speak about it, incorporate in our teachings, in our conversations. It's going to be tempting to just want to avoid the topic altogether, but certainly Jesus did not avoid the topic. We're going to see he talks about hell more than anybody. And statistic people say he talks about hell more than heaven, which I haven't confirmed that yet, but at least it's rivaling. So, all right, cool. Let's just go ahead and get into it. Some relevant terms we're going to be looking at. The top three, we'll be talking about some of these today. The bottom three will be future lessons. So, of course, we've got hell. We have Gehenna. Gehenna might be a familiar term. Tartarus probably is a less familiar term, but we're going to talk about that. Then Hades and Sheol. Those should be pretty familiar depending on what translation you have. And that will not come into our lesson very much today. So kind of be on the lookout for those terms. Something real quick about the translation of the word hell. So the word hell, at least in the New American Standard and basically all modern English translations, not King James Version, but other modern English languages, are going to have hell translated into the Bible 13 times. 12 of those times, 11 of those times, are going to be found in the Gospels. As you can see, Matthew, it's 7 times, Mark 3 times, Luke once. And the only other 2 times we see the word hell in most common New American Standard translations is once in the book of James, and then that's once in the book of 2 Peter, which that's supposed to be 2 Peter, not some Gnostic thing there. So only twice mentioned the word by anybody besides Jesus himself. So that's an interesting topic. That should give us something to think about. Now let's talk about the words that are translated into hell. The word Gehenna, which is more familiar to some of us, that makes up that Greek word. Well, that's a Hebrew word there, but the word Gehenna is translated into hell 12 times. Every time that word's found, it's always translated into hell. However, there is one other word, hell, in the New Testament, according to the New American Standard and ESV, and it's not the word Gehenna. It's actually coming from the word Tartarus. So if in most common English translations, every time you read hell, it's the word Gehenna, except for once in 2 Peter, it's actually a different word, Tartarus. And we'll talk about that difference there today. Now, another big difference is in the King James Version, and maybe also the New King James Version, I'm not sure. If you look at the King James Version, you're going to see hell abundantly more frequently. 54 times we find the word hell. Now, how can the King James Version have hell 54 times and other modern English translations only like 13 times? Well, that's because the Hebrew word in the Old Testament, Sheol, and the Greek word in the New Testament, Hades, King James will also translate those as hell. Now, I think we're going to see as we study, there is a distinct difference between the concept of Hades, Sheol. Those are the same, and the concept of hell, 2 different ideas, but our first English translations translated them both as hell, and I think that was a bad translation idea, and it muddied up the waters. I think that's not as common of a problem now with as many other English translations we have. I think the distinction there is much more obvious. But if you find yourself in a King James Version and you read the word hell, don't assume it's necessarily what we would commonly identify as hell based on what Jesus teaches. Is that making sense, or am I speaking too convoluted, Dad?
I was going to say that you called my name for the New King James. The New King James, I just checked one spot and it used Hades instead. So I think the New King James tried to improve the use of hell. So it's not as big a number.
All right, cool. Any King James only people in here? Oh. Didn't think so. Okay. Other thoughts, comments, questions? If that wasn't clear, let me know and I'll say something again. Good to go. All right, so let's keep going here. By the way, can you guys see my screen, or do you see the picture of yourself above it?
Down the side here.
We see the PowerPoint and we can see each other on the side.
Oh, is that awkward? I can minimize it. Well,
Actually, I mean, you're gonna see us on a different way, but we don't see it the same way you do.
Okay. Well, it looks fine to me. I can't even see my mouse cursor with the PowerPoint, so that's confusing. Okay, so let's talk about the word Gehenna. Now, the actual Greek word you're going to find in your Greek manuscripts is that second line there, Geena, and it's actually going to be pronounced very similar to Gehenna, even though it's spelled differently. So that's the Greek transliteration of the Hebrew word Gehenna. Now, the Hebrew word Gehenna, what is that? It's the Hebrew word that means the valley of Hinnom. So apparently you take the word gay or guy in Hebrew and then put Hinnom after that, You've got valley. Hinnom is the name of a guy that the valley is named after. So Gehinnom, Valley of Hinnom. And the Greek transliteration of Gehinnom is Gehenna. So this is what you have here. You've got the Hebrew word Gehinnom, which we're going to find in the Old Testament. Then the Greek transliteration, which is Gehenna. And again, a transliteration, that's the choice translators make when rather than translating the word, they create a new word. So the actual translation of Gehinnom would be Valley of Hinnom. But we're not translating it, we're transliterating it, making a brand new word in your translated language. So Gehinnom becomes Gehenna, Gehenna, and then the English transliteration of Gehenna would be Gehenna. Now the English translation, the choice has been to translate that into hell. And so basically you've got the original word Gehinnom translated into Greek or transliterated into Greek or translated into English. But in our English translations, we've chosen a whole different word. Rather than transliterate and make a new word, Gehenna, we've chosen to translate it into the word hell, which we're going to talk about where the actual word hell itself comes from. All right, does that make sense? Are we good with that? Do we know what transliteration is and all? Any questions on that? So Gehenna is the word that is translated into hell, but we're going to see where the original word hell comes from and why they use the word hell rather than transliterate. My point I'm going to be making is I think it would have been more advantageous to actually translate it literally Valley of Gehenna, or even transliterate it. The choice of hell maybe wasn't the best choice, but here we are. So if you think about it, when Jesus says this in Matthew 5:29, if your right eye makes you stumble, tear it out, throw it from you, for it is better for you to lose one of your body parts than for your whole body to be thrown. I'm talking literal. It's better to lose your hand than your whole body to be thrown into the Valley of Hinnom. That's what the actual translation would be. Or if we're translating it into Gehenna, which would be the English transliteration of the Greek transliteration of the Hebrew word Gehenna. So Jesus is talking about whether or not we want to be thrown into the Valley of Hinnom. That's what we're dealing with here. Now, we're going to talk a lot about what the Valley of Hinnom is, and then we'll know what that really means. But again, the point is we shouldn't just hear hell and say, oh, I know what hell is. We should hear the Valley of Hinnom and say, what's the Valley of Hinnom? Then you figure out what that Valley of Hinnom is. Now you know what hell is more accurately. Okay. So there's also the word Tartarus. Now in the middle of the screen here, 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4, you're going to see the word hell in the middle of that. For God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to pits of darkness reserved for judgment. Now this is the one time you're going to find the word hell in an English translation, and it's not the word Gehenna. This is actually related to the word Tartarus. Now, Tartarus is from the Greek mythology. It's the Greek mythology for a pit of punishment. Now, there is Hades, which is also Greek mythology, but Hades is the realm of the dead. I think it's more neutral, whereas Tartarus is more of an active place and pit of punishment. If you know anything about Greek mythology, which I know very little, this is where Zeus and Hades and another god joined forces against the bigger gods, defeated them, cast the Titans down into this pit, Tartarus, to be punished. And apparently all wicked humans will also end up in this pit dungeon of torment. And so Tartarus is that Greek mythological location. Now, the word we find here in 2 Peter 2:4 is not actually the common noun Tartarus, but rather it's a verb form, tartaru, which tartaru means to cast into Tartarus. So these angels are going to be cast into Tartarus and committed to these pits of darkness. So it's not really the word Gehenna there. That's not the Valley of Hinnom. That's borrowing from the Greek mythos to bring up the image of a place of where spiritual beings are tormented as they wait for judgment. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Now, does that mean we have to believe that the Bible is endorsing Greek mythology? Well, we read Hades, we don't think that. Tartarus is the same thing. It's borrowing imagery that people knew and understood. I don't think it's a validation that the Greek understanding of Tartarus is an actual place and so forth. But it's speaking and borrowing from that same idea of a place where spiritual beings are cast to be tormented. To get ahead of myself, I think actually this hell here, Tartaru, is not the same thing that Jesus is talking about when he speaks about Gehenna. It seems to me that this is a place where they are awaiting judgment, and that judgment is going to be what we know as Gehenna, whereas this hell, this Tartaru that they are cast into and being held there is something else entirely, but we'll get there. All right, that was actually new information for me. So I thought it'd be good for you guys to be aware of that. But again, I don't think it's that big of a deal. But when people talk about, oh yeah, well, the Bible talks about Tartarus, you know where it is. It's good to be aware of that and understand what's happening there. Does that make sense? Cool. Questions, comments, thoughts? All right, hopefully that's helpful information. Okay, now let's talk about, again, we're about to talk about the Valley of Hinnom, which that's going to be the more important thing we talk about today. But, of course, we're taking our time to get there. Let's talk about the actual word hell. Why did the English translations choose to use the word hell rather than translating Gehenna into the transliteration Gehenna or the actual translation Valley of Hinnom? Well, the word hell is of Germanic origin. In Germanic languages, we're talking English, German, Dutch, Scandinavian. Shout out for Norway. And so this is basically, hell is their word for their mythological underworld / place of judgment. You've got the Old English, which is hell, hell, or hell. Dutch, hell. German, hula, or I don't know how to say that right. And you can see here, it's a netherworld. Literal meaning is a concealed place, something. It's actually from the Norse mythos. Those of you who have seen Ragnarok know that Thor and Loki, they fight their sister Hela. The actual true Norse mythology is that the name is not Hela, it's Hel. Excuse me. And it's actually Loki's daughter. So Hel is the name of this goddess of the underworld, and then Hell is also the word that's used to refer to that place. So what happens is when we were originally translating the Bible into English, we read about Gehenna, and we read about this place that seems to be of torment for the wicked, this place of death, and we say, well, we've got that word in English, we've got our mythos, we've got hell, which is our place of death and torment. So rather than make a new word based on the Hebrew or the Greek word, we're going to use our mythos word, hell, and bring that and then replace Gehenna with hell and use that instead. And over the years, the mythos of hell is long forgotten. You hear hell, we don't think about any Norse mythology. You hear hell, we only think about Christian theology. Because that's what the word has been repurposed to mean. But it's an entirely different word. Does that make sense? Is that at least interesting to know? Maybe, hopefully. So that was also very new information to me. But maybe,
I'm sure in all cultures too, all cultures have their version of hell and their translation. And I think probably the German are just maybe like Western influences really is just what dominated, and that's how that word is the most common one used. I don't know like the history of it, but I feel like as like the Bible evolved like through languages and what was the most common at the time.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And so it's not the worst thing in the world, but when we actually start studying the Valley of Hinnom and we start looking at verses that we've never read in reference to our idea of hell, then we kind of say, man, it's unfortunate we didn't see this actual context all these times that we were reading about hell. That's what we lost. I don't think it's going to be too big of a game changer, but we would have had a better context for hell had we had a more literal translation. Even though a lot of what we understand about hell and a lot of what the world understands, yeah, all cultures, we have this, we have this place of punishment for wicked people. It's a very universal thing, which is interesting. So not the worst decision in the world, but good comment. All right. Okay. Any other questions or comments before we move on? All right, moving on. Okay. All right, so let's talk about the Valley of Hinnom. First things first, where is the Valley of Hinnom? If you see here on the lower, on the bottom side of or border of this picture, just south of Jerusalem is the Hinnom Valley. This is here in the days of Jesus. But if you look at Joshua 15:8 there at the bottom, you realize that this Valley of Hinnom has been there since the Israelites conquered Canaan. So the Hinnom Valley has been there since before they even owned the land. So that's where it is. So when Jesus is talking about the Valley of Hinnom, he's not talking about some distant, mystical place. He's talking about around the corner, right? If you look over on the east, you see the Kidron Valley. And if you've been reading through Samuel or Kings today, or even through the Gospels, we read about the Kidron Valley a lot. It's a very common, normal place. Well, Hinnom Valley, no different. It's a very common, well-known, everybody knew about Hinnom. They could look over and see. So when he says it's better for this than to be cast into the Valley of Hinnom, imagine hearing that and you know exactly where that is. And you know exactly what literal valley Jesus is referring to. So that takes away some of the fantastical nature of it. Also, some other names for the Valley of Hinnom. As you go through the Old Testament, you're going to see a couple of words used for the Valley of Hinnom. You're going to see also called the Valley of the Sons or the Valley of the Son of Hinnom. Therefore, you'll see it Valley of Ben Hinnom. Ben is the Hebrew word for son. So Ben Hinnom is the Hebrew transliteration of sons of Hinnom. So the Valley of Ben Hinnom. But we're also going to see during the times of the kings, it's referred to as Topheth. And Topheth is a new name that was given to it. And we are not sure, but it's possible that it's named Topheth in reference to drum. Apparently drum is the word toph or toph. Or there's also the word taf, which is to burn. We're going to see in just a second that the Valley of Hinnom is where they practice child sacrifice by fire. So Topheth might have been a name that was placed because of those child sacrifices. So if you ever see the Valley of the Sons of Hinnom or the Valley of Hinnom or Ben Hinnom or Topheth, it's all talking about the same place. All right, so what do we know about this particular valley? Let's take a look at some of the history. I can't see my cursor, so hold on one second here. How do I back out of this thing? I'm trapped. That's weird. I can't even exit out of it. Well, forget it. Oh, you stopped my sharing. There we go. Thank you, Anthony. Oh my goodness. I'm sorry. I should just left it as it is. Let's try this again. Oh my God. Okay, here we go. Let me do this right there. Well, it's just Jennifer. Hi, Jennifer. Oops, hold on. Okay, sorry about that. Nice use of time. Okay. I'm not sure why it's just showing Jennifer, but sorry about that. Okay. Okay, so here we have some history of the Valley of Hinnom. 2 Chronicles 28:3, we have King Ahaz. And what is Ahaz doing? He's burning incense in the Valley of Ben Hinnom, burning his sons in the fire according to the abominations of the nations whom the Lord had driven out before the sons of Israel. I think in that text, it's in reference to Baal worship. Flash forward just a few generations, Manasseh, or is that just one generation? Manasseh made his sons pass through the fire in the Valley of Ben Hinnom, and he practiced witchcraft, used divination, practiced sorcery, and dealt with mediums and spiritists. He did much evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to evil. All right, so based on this history here already, what things are going to be associated with the Valley of Hinnom? This is where you guys can talk. Kind of an easy question, but what do you got?
Unfaithfulness.
All right, unfaithfulness, sin, wickedness, right? What else?
Fire.
What?
Fire.
Yeah, fire, right? Burning people, right? Like, not just fire, but humans burning. What else? All right, it's a place of fire and suffering, it's a place of evil and wicked. It's almost a home, a realm of wickedness and evil and idolatry. It involves people burning there. So there's a lot of significance in this particular valley here. Flash forward a little bit. Oh my God. Oh my God, I'm having, oh, there we go. Yeah. Flash forward a little bit in history. Josiah, he goes back there, and here it calls it Topheth, which is the valley of the sons of Hinnom. And he defiles that location, putting an end to the idol worship that is being done there. But if we look forward in the book of Jeremiah, Jeremiah has some special messages in relation to this particular valley. Now, Jeremiah prophesied during the reign of Josiah and also subsequent kings thereafter up until the destruction of Jerusalem. So it is, so the human child sacrifice done in the valley of Hinnom would have been done very, very recently. It's probably only recently put to an end, if at all. And it's also likely that it came back during the prophetic ministry of Jeremiah. But if you look at Jeremiah's message about the Valley of Hinnom, you can go to chapter 7, and basically he preaches almost the same message twice. Chapter 7, he goes to the gate of the temple, and he declares at the temple gate to all those who are coming into the temple, he says, the sons of Judah have been doing evil things here in my name, defiling it. They have built the high places of Topheth, which is in the valley of the sons of Hinnom, to burn their sons and daughters in the fire. That's something I did not command, nor ever came into my mind. So Jeremiah, just around the corner from this particular valley, speaks to those going in the temple, speaking condemnation for what they have been doing, burning their children alive. Then he preaches this, therefore, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when they will no longer be called Topheth, or the valley of the son of Hinnom, but rather the valley of slaughter. For they will bury in Topheth, because there is no other place. The dead bodies of this people will be food for the birds of the sky and for the beasts of the earth, and no one will frighten them away. So look at the meaning that God gives to this valley. Just as you have been slaughtering and killing and burning your own children, so when I come to slaughter and kill you, when God comes to slaughter and annihilate the wicked Judeans in Jerusalem by the Babylonian armies, he says that we're going to gather the dead bodies and throw them in this valley, because that's the only place that's going to have enough room for all your dead bodies. So very graphic image of destruction. Let me go to Jeremiah 19. This whole chapter has a similar message. Now he actually goes to that same valley. He goes, instead of preaching this at the temple, he goes to the valley of Ben Hinnom and proclaims basically the same thing there. You've done all these evil things. You've forsaken me. You've filled us with the blood of the innocent. You've burned your sons by fire to Baal. Therefore, the days are coming when this will not be called Topheth, but rather the valley of slaughter, because I'm going to take all your dead bodies and I'm going to cast them into this valley. It'll be full of carcasses left to be eaten by the birds. And I'm going to make you guys eat each other's flesh. You're going to eat your own children during this Babylonian siege. It'll be time of great suffering and distress. Skip a little bit farther. This is how I will treat this place and its inhabitants, declares the Lord, so as to make this city like Topheth. Just as Topheth, was a place where your children were burned and killed, and I'm going to take your corpses and cast them in Topheth. All of Jerusalem will be like that valley, filled with dead bodies and filled with suffering. The houses of Jerusalem, the houses of kings of Judah will all be defiled like Topheth because of all the houses on the rooftops. They burn sacrifices to all the heavenly hosts. So everybody who's been sinning everywhere is going to have this same suffering fate as the innocent did in Topheth, and also as those who God sent there, God whose corpses he cast there. So man, so we are talking about a valley that is not only associated with human suffering and people burning and evil and sin, where evil and sin reside. It's also a valley associated with piles of dead corpses of sinners who are being punished for their crimes committed in that very place. That is a very loud significance that Jesus is calling upon. So when Jesus says statements, whoever says, "You fool," yelling at his brother, cursing at his brother, he shall be guilty enough to go into the fires of the valley of Hinnom. Or when he speaks about the wickedness of the Pharisees, you guys are hypocrites because you travel around the world to convert a proselyte and you make him twice a son of the valley of Hinnom as yourself. And think about the imagery and the significance that Jesus is calling upon when he's referencing the history of this infamous location. Does that make sense? So that's a very, very, very powerful image. Again, death and destruction. God can kill both your soul and body in this valley of Hinnom. So there is some spiritual significance given to this valley. It's not just a regular natural place. It's a place where your soul can be destroyed. Look here, he says in Mark 9, it's better to lose a body part than go with all of your body parts into the valley of Hinnom, where the worm is undying and the fire is eternal. How can you escape the sentence of the valley of Hinnom? Remember how God made a sentence to cast these wicked people there? How are you going to escape that sentence, that judgment? So it really makes Jesus's use and reference to the valley of Hinnom come alive when we know the horrific history of that location. Thoughts or comments or questions on that so far?
I have a question.
What was that?
So I understand you start reading in Chronicles, right? Like that was around that time, around the kings that they start using that word.
Well, so the Valley of Hinnom has always been a location, but it seems like during the times of Ahaz, around there in Manasseh is when they were really going strong with human sacrifice in that particular valley. And that's probably where the word Topheth originated. We don't read about Topheth before that. At least I don't think we do. And so Topheth is probably a new name given, maybe because of what was going on there.
So maybe my question, then the next question is, and you're probably going to address this, so it's probably not for now. It's like more like a big picture. It's like before this, then was there's this idea of hell before, but there was I know you mentioned like Hades and Sheol, and maybe how is.
Okay, very, very good. That's actually a really great question. So Hades is New Testament, so we can forget about that. But Sheol is basically the absolute equivalent of Hades. And that is a word that is used much, much before any of this Valley of Hinnom history, much before Jesus starts talking about the Valley of Hinnom in this way. And we're going to see that Sheol represents just the realm of death. No, not being alive, but rather being dead. And it's... and you have to study a lot and figure out when Sheol is being spoken of. Is it being spoken of an actual literal location, or the concept not being alive, but rather being dead?
Okay.
And so that's its own study. And it's not really related to what Jesus has been saying or referring to here, or the Valley of Hinnom. You said, actually, you had another thing you said that needed to answer. That was a really good question. What else was it? Yeah. Okay. And we're about to look at a passage from Isaiah, which that is going to date pre-Jeremiah, obviously, and pre-Ahaz, actually during Ahaz. And there is going to be a reference to a burning valley, a valley of eternal burning fire reserved for enemies. And that actually does predate, or it's actually contemporary with Ahaz, predates Manasseh. And it's not called the Valley of Hinnom. It's its own concept. So even apart from this Valley of Hinnom, there's already reference to this place of eternal burning and suffering of God's enemies. And we're going to see when Jesus speaks about the Valley of Gehenna, he also borrows that imagery from Isaiah. So it really makes us believe that even apart from reference to this valley, there's still a concept of this punishment,
Okay.
which makes the reality of hell more credible. That makes sense?
Yeah. Thank
Right.
you.
Very, very good question. Very quick. Other questions? All right, let's quickly talk about the Valley of Hinnom in Jesus' day. There is common commentary going around about how in the days of Jesus, this Valley of Hinnom was this perpetual valley, this valley of perpetual burning waste. I feel like I've heard that a lot. I hear people repeat that a lot, that in Jesus' day that this valley was filled up with waste and refuse, and it was burning perpetually. And so when Jesus refers to the Valley of Hinnom, he's referring to that actual location where that actual burning was happening. Now that is actually referencing commentary made by Rabbi David Kimmey in 1200. And he spoke of the Valley of Hinnom was where they would burn the offal and the refuse, meaning there are portions of the sacrifices that you would not burn on the altar. It would depend on which sacrifice and so forth, but a lot of the goops that would come out of the intestines and things, and also the intestines, not just that, intestines themselves and stuff, you would not burn that on the altar. You would take it outside of the city to be burned. And the Valley of Hinnom is outside the city, and it actually would make sense to take things there and burn them. But then the idea of there would be so much offal and refuse that you would want it to be burning perpetually, continually, to deal with the abundance of waste and the odor. So it's possible that that was also going on in the days of Jesus. However, for my research, that whole concept comes from this one rabbi who made this commentary in 1200 AD. So I don't know how credible that is. Certainly it's a possibility, but I would not hang my understanding of hell or Jesus' reference to the Valley of Hinnom on that commentary. I think the actual biblical references to it in Jeremiah give us a more worthy base for our understanding of the Valley of Hinnom, of hell. This could be a possible addition to it, but I would encourage you to go back to Jeremiah 7:19 and let that be the foundation of your understanding of the Valley of Hinnom, more than that common commentary of it being a burning valley of waste. But you might disagree with me on that. And does anybody have any thoughts on that, or? I guess not. All right. Everyone must agree with me. Okay, let's see. We got about 10 minutes left. Let's open up our discussion of hell a bit now, and not just talk about the Valley of Hinnom, but just talk about the idea of, is there a place of punishment? You know, you can read the word hell. We can read the Valley of Hinnom, know what Jesus is referencing, but is it bigger than just the Valley of Hinnom? The Valley of Hinnom is a literal, actual place that you could go. Is what Jesus is talking about really just limited to that valley, or is that valley a reference of the bigger picture of this theological concept, a place of punishment? And I would like to suggest that the idea that there is a place of punishment that's bigger than just the word Gehenna. That because there is a spiritual reality of this place of eternal punishment, Jesus refers to that spiritual reality with the image of the Valley of Hinnom. And so we can see that that is the case. We're going to go to Isaiah chapter 30. Isaiah chapter 30 is a very fascinating passage in this discussion. We're going to skip down to verse 18 here. And 18 through 26 is actually speaking about the restoration of God's people. He's going to have compassion on his people. Zion will weep no longer. They're going to defile their own images. So a very positive passage about the restoration of God's people, both physically, both and spiritually. But that leads us into, but amongst that discussion, if you look at verse 25, there is also reference to a day of great slaughter. So all these things are going to be good. And by the way, there's a day of great slaughter. So we would wonder, what's this day of great slaughter? What's that got to do with God's restoration of his people? Well, if you skip down here to verse 27, now he begins to speak about the destruction of his enemies. He's got burning anger. He's going to come like a torrent. He's going to put bridles in the jaws of his enemies. God's voice will be heard, descending in fierce anger, flame, consuming fire, and so forth. And here we go. For at the voice of the Lord, Assyria will be terrified. And Assyria is going to be the actual political threat and enemies of God's people pretty soon. So the restoration of God's people, this day of great slaughter, which seems to be the day when God brings vengeance against his enemies. Well, that takes us all the way down here to verse 33. For Topheth has long been ready. Now that's important. That's the same thing as Jesus saying the Valley of Hinnom. You know, with no direct context connecting us back to he's not talking about the Valley of Hinnom. He's not talking about Topheth and child sacrifice. He's talking about restoring his people and punishing his enemies. And yet what does he do? He borrows the imagery and the significance of the Valley of Hinnom and Topheth and says Topheth is ready. For what? Indeed, it has been prepared for the king. That's a lowercase k, king. He has made Topheth, the valley, to be deep and large. He's filled it with firewood. And the breath of the Lord, like a torrent of brimstone, sets it afire. Wow, that is very clear imagery. This future restoration of God's people, this wholesale vengeance against God's enemies being typified by Assyria, and they're going to be, and God has Topheth being prepared, this valley of fire and suffering. He's prepared it, filled with firewood, so he can light it ablaze and put in the king, the evil king of Assyria and all his people. So we have this imagery of a valley of abundant fire reserved for the enemies of God, and reference back to Topheth. And so that's even predating Jeremiah. So outside of, anyways, so that's a pretty clear concept right there. Questions or thoughts on that? We've got one more Isaiah passage we're going to look at. Okay, let's take a look at Isaiah 66. We're going to see a pretty similar thing happen here. Isaiah 66, you take a look at verse 10. Same thing. Look at this restoration God has for his people. Join Jerusalem in gladness, comforting, peace, and all this cool stuff. He talks about in verse 14, then God's going to punish his enemies. He's coming in fire, chariots executing judgment by fire. So God's going to punish his enemies. You get to verse 18. This is quite interesting. I might actually read this. I'm not sure. Basically, he's talking about how he's going to take his kind of converted, conquered enemies to search for his people who are scattered and help restore them back. So more restoration language, good stuff going on there. 22, 23. For just as the new heavens and the new earth, which I make will endure before me, declares the Lord, so your offspring and your name will endure. And it shall be from new moon to new moon, from Sabbath to Sabbath, all mankind will come down and bow before me, says the Lord. What a great restoration. This is the new heavens and the new earth. The spiritual restoration of his people, where all inhabitants of the world will worship and adore the true God, Yahweh. But what also will those restored worshipers of God do? They will go forth, and mind you, this is the last verse in Isaiah. This is how the book of Isaiah ends. They will go forth and look on the corpses of men who have transgressed against me. For their worm will not die, and their fire will not be quenched. They will be an abhorrence to all mankind. The restored of God will go forth and look on piles of corpses of men who transgressed against God. And what's going to happen to these corpses? There is this undying worm. So it's this idea of being eternally eaten by these worms, and where the fire is not quenched, continual burning, and yet nothing's burning up. It will be an abhorrence to all mankind. And that's how the book of Isaiah ends. Now here, there's no mention to the valley of Hinnom or Tophet, but we're borrowing the same imagery. And remember, when Jesus speaks about the valley of Hinnom in Mark chapter 9, verse 43, it's better for you to cut off your hand than to and enter into life as a cripple than to have two hands and go into the valley of Hinnom, where there is the unquenchable fire. And he says it again in verse 47. If your eye causes you to stumble, throw it out. It's better for you to enter into the kingdom of heaven with God with one eye than to have two eyes and be cast into the valley of Hinnom, where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. Quoting that last passage there in Isaiah, connecting the idea that this place of punishment reserved for God's enemies is the same thing that Jesus is referring to when he's borrowing the imagery of the valley of Hinnom. Does that make sense? So again, we're not talking about like specific prophecies like Jesus' side would be pierced, but we are setting forth theological concepts. You know, is God going to restore his people, and is God going to punish his enemies? That's what's being discussed here. The specifics, I think, are true in many cases. There is the immediate truth of the restoration of God's people and the punishment of Assyria, the punishment of Babylon. But we also know it's bigger than that. We also know that Jesus references it, and he says, listen, this is also true of the entire existence, that God's going to gather his people and restore his people to be in his eternal kingdom forever. And God's going to gather and punish his people as well. And so it's this big idea being set forth of the reality of a place where God is going to punish. And that place where that God punishes is in contrast to the restoration of God's people. I think we can see this as being theological ideas being set forth in the prophets that are then confirmed and expounded upon in more specific detail in the New Testament. So it's bigger than just this use of the word hell. It's a spiritual reality that Jesus is calling hell and giving us more information about. Thoughts on that? Guys are pretty quiet.
I think that's right. I think that's just a good overview.
All right. I like that comment. It means I'm doing a good job. Yeah, and to me, I think it's really cool. Man, we can do a lot. And this is only half of the lesson, mind you. We have a whole other lesson. We're going to keep talking some more specifics about hell. But yeah, it's not that mysterious. It's a pretty solid and clear doctrinal teaching. And you look at the imagery and how it's being used and spoken of, and we really can't understand a lot about the real nature of hell, and not have that much confusion. We're going to next week go further into discussion of whether or not hell is real. There's different ideas about hell being real, whether it's eternal and stuff. So we're going to take a look at those specifics and really look at the way Jesus speaks about hell, and we'll be able to figure out if it's real or not. Oh, I hear him cheering for the doctors. Ooh. Go doctors, medical people. And so we'll take a look at that next week. The only thing we didn't get to do today that I wanted to is just take a look at a list of verses of the way Jesus speaks about this place of judgment without actually referencing hell. We might look at that real quick next time. So last thoughts, questions, comments.
It feels like it maybe also goes with other kinds of imagery where it comes back to a root often, or a new shoot. He comes back to that idea of things overflowing with goodness, and this, you know, this always connected with this burning and unquenchable fire being with judgment and punishment. So we're used to that in other imagery in the Bible, right?
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Yeah. And the other imagery that goes with is also this darkness, you know, and so that's a whole different idea. So there's a different imagery that's got nothing to do with the Valley of Gehenna, but also being used. And we'll talk about that some as well. So, all right. Well, many thanks, you guys. I hope this was an interesting study, not tedious. Maybe it's tedious on you guys' end. Hopefully not. But I do feel like, yeah, you can dig deep and really quickly find some pretty clear, I don't know, just get a good understanding of hell pretty quickly from some very substantial sources. There's not a lot of guesswork. This is pretty clear stuff. So I'm actually was pretty encouraged by how clear things are becoming. So last thoughts, comments, questions.
Thank you so much for the class.
Cool.
Yeah, it's a good class.
Anybody want to say something positive? So it's not all hell and brimstone.
There we are.
No, thank you.
Let's say a quick prayer and then maybe we can say hey for a second.